it's been called the most haunted town in America. The tiny town of historic Rugby in northeast Tennessee. It was founded in 1880 by author Thomas Hughes, who wrote the first children's book, Tom Brown's School Days. I'm holding it right there. And he used the money he made from it to buy land on the Cumberland Plateau. He wanted to establish a utopian village. That idea didn't work. Well, then typhoid fever took the lives of many. Today, Rugby has a population of 75, maybe more, though, if you include the dearly departed who have decided to stay. In the shadow of Big South Fork River and Recreation Area, the tiny Victorian village in historic Rugby hasn't changed much in the last 120 years. Perhaps that's why some of the spirits of those long departed have apparently decided to stay.
I think when you walk through these historic buildings up here, you definitely get the sense that you are not by yourself.
One of those buildings, the old Newberry House, still open for overnight guests, the scene of many unexplained events through the years. Rugby resident Howard Hafner recalls the day he and a friend were in the kitchen of the house, the only ones there, or so they thought.
We heard children laughing in the front of the house, and both of us heard it, so there was no explanation for these children laughing. And then I asked around in the village, and other people had experienced that same thing at Newberry.
You gotta get it here if you want to check. Let's go check. All right. Okay.
With our guide, Jordan Hewitt, who works with the historic Rugby Visitor Center, we ventured upstairs at Newberry House to learn more about another ghostly encounter many visitors have experienced. London businessman Charles Oldfield died in this room more than a century ago while waiting for his wife to arrive.
It's kind of cold in here.
Some say Mr. Oldfield is still here.
When females stay in this room, that if they feel a nudge or they feel a touch, it's because he's checking to see if his wife come back to see him.
So many visitors have experienced his presence, they make time to visit Laureldale Cemetery, where many of the town's early citizens are buried.
I think people hear about Charles and him haunting that room.
Charles Oldfield's grave is there too. You'll find pennies on his marker, placed by those paying their respects. Other ghostly encounters closer to town on an overgrown road. There have been sounds of a phantom horse-drawn carriage. There's a story to tell in just about all of the oldest buildings in Rugby. 17 of the original Victorian structures remain, housing the Thomas Hughes Free Library, where every book was published in 1900 or before. But Rugby isn't just a village steeped in the past. There's plenty of land for development, and dozens have chosen to build homes here, but they must follow Rugby's strict rules. Rugby is on the National Register of Historic Places, so even in a newer development like this, every home must be constructed in the Victorian style. After all, you wouldn't want to upset the spirits, would you?
Initially, the land was purchased in 1878 by a man named Franklin W. Smith. And he is, I believe he's from Boston, but he was trying to create a community to help deal with the recession that we were having in the U.S. at that time. A lot of people were being laid off from work in the cities and such, so he was developing a community for them. So with that in mind, that's how this initially started. So he started a lot of the original survey and even the landscape and everything for the community. Now by 1880, though, his audience that he needed was no longer available. The recession had ended, and he needed a new clientele. So with that in mind, you have another man that joined in, who was an investor. Thomas Hughes was his name. He was an Englishman, a lawyer, judge, member of Parliament, but he was part of the English upper class, or the gentry there. So he wanted to use this place and invest in it for the second and third sons of England. Most of these men were from the upper class families. In that case, usually your eldest son inherited the entire estate when the parents passed away. Second and third might get lump sums or annuities, but nothing to live off of. And with that in mind, it was actually socially considered unacceptable to work a lot of jobs like agricultural, your mercantile business type positions. Typically, for that status, you would work jobs like lawyers, doctors, and priests. So it was actually more shameful to work those type of jobs than not work at all. So a lot of the men were going into a state of idleness. So what Thomas Hughes wanted to do was use this colony here in Tennessee so that they could leave England, move here, work the agricultural and the mercantile type jobs without that social stigma attachment. So that was the initial plan, and he started taking over in 1880. So since Thomas Hughes did not actually use this house, he did rent it, and the first family to live in this house was the Blacklock family, and that would be Joseph Blacklock and his family. Now, Joseph Blacklock was the first church rector for Christ Church. So that's who actually lived in it, and at that time, they believed there was 10 people living in the house.
Oh, wow.
Now, the house has went through a lot of changes. It was actually lived in as a residence up until the 1960s. So one thing you notice is that it is decorated with black, and you notice there's a black wreath there with white flowers. The white color is actually significant to this house would be going through a mourning period. The family would have lost someone that would be a youth, a young child, basically. So typically you would be greeted by a family friend, brought into the parlor for the actual funeral.
Oh, this is sweet.
The child in the picture itself, we know it's from the time frame. We know very little about where the child was from, or it was not from Rugby, actually. But that is representing two things. One, that's a post-mortem image, which was common in this period. Not only to take pictures of funerals, which is still common today, but it's also common to pose the body in a like they're doing everyday life, like they're still alive. Now, as much as we may see that as morbid today, that was not done for that reason. It was done more to actually lock in that memory and show respect to the loved one. They just don't want to let them go. They're actually grieving and they don't want to lose the loved one. So that's why they do images like that. But now the reason we chose a young child is because the first burial record we have for Laureldale Cemetery, just down the road here, was for a 7-month-old that passed away in January of 1881 by the name of Eddie James Boone. And that was the first burial record we have. Now, as far as the parlor itself, your furnishings are original from the time frame. As I said, though, there's very little original to the house, but we do have some furnishings original to Rugby, including the piano, which is covered in black there. That is a baby grand piano, and it is one of 7 that was brought to Rugby during the time frame. This one would have actually been used in the lobby of what was known as the Tabard Inn, which was a grand hotel. It was a 3-story hotel. It was built in 1880, but sadly it was lost in 1884 before this house was built. So it actually was lost to fire. They did rebuild it in 1887, but the second Tabard Hotel burned by 1900. So, other original furnishings, the 2 statues here. The first one is of our founder, Thomas Hughes. The second is his sister, Janie. Now, both statues were made for Margaret Hughes, Thomas's mother, and she actually had these statues down at Uffington House when she lived here. And they were sculpted by the gentleman in the caricature there. That's Sir Joseph Edgar Bowman. He's a well-known British sculptor of the period. In fact, the caricature refers to him as a Queen sculptor. So he likely did work for Queen Victoria, who we have here. So do y'all have any questions about this room?
Is there a reason why that black sheath is...
It's over the mirrors?
Yeah.
You'll notice it more in the next room, but...
I mean, I know why it's done, but...
Yeah. So we're honoring the fact that in the Victorian period, they would actually cover mirrors because they believed that if the spirit of the loved one that passed saw the reflection, the spirit would be trapped in the mirror for eternity.
Okay.
So we have it in here, and then in the bedroom, which is where I would also talk about it, there's 2 mirrors covered for that same reason. Yeah.
You just feel the energy in here.
So we'll head across the hall.
Look how tiny the stairs are. They're so narrow. Oh, this is cool. Oh.
So the room we're actually entering would have been your family room or family parlor, but we do have it set up as a bedroom since we don't go upstairs. Partly because there's still the openings from the fireplaces that would have been in this house, and then partly, as you were mentioning, the average body type was less than ours, so the staircases are very steep and narrow for a lot of us today. So the bed frame is original to Twin Oaks, and that's a private residence today, but it was built in that period. This dresser over here was actually original to the Tabard Inn, and it would have been used in the guest rooms of the Tabard Inn. And the marble dresser there is actually the one piece we believe is original to the house, Kingston Marble. Now on the bed, it was common that they wanted or strive for what's called the good death. And in this picture, you can see a picture of Prince Albert before he passed away. And he actually has the good death. And what I mean by that is they would actually die in their bed at home with all their friends and loved ones with them. That was kind of what you hoped for when you passed away. Now the gentleman in this picture is Charles Oldfield. Now Charles Oldfield was sent from London, England to investigate some issues between the management of the local Board of Aid office here in Rugby versus the management between the London Board of Aid. So he's kind of sent as an investigator of the sorts. But when he arrived, he fell in love with Rugby, and he loved it so much he was intending to get his wife and children to move from England to Rugby to be with him. Sadly, before that loved one passed away far from you, you would receive a letter with a black border, and usually the envelope would have a black border as well. And that's where you get the saying, letter edged in black. So what this is basically giving you a heads up that you need to be aware that you've lost a loved one. So you need to be ready when you read the letter. Now the flat image in the picture frame, that is a copy of the letter, or the envelope, I'm sorry, sent to Thomas Hughes to notify him of his death, Margaret Hughes, of the death of his mother, Margaret Hughes, here in Rugby. He was actually in England at the time. He was heading back to England when she passed away.
How long was that trip?
And that, I'm not sure on that. That's something I need to look up. So, I mean, it sounds like it probably was at least a couple month or two is what I would think. So in the dining room, we do have some items out, but you notice it's kind of sparse on a lot of your kitchen items, or things that you would expect for formal dinners and such. Today, and even the Appalachian farmers that live here, usually when someone passes away, you have a big formal meal for all your friends and loved ones to have after the funeral. In the Victorian area, that was not as common. Typically, the family would be in a grieving process, so when they actually ate, they would eat by themselves in their beds. You would not have your formal funeral dinners. They might do a funeral tea for the guest, and then on occasion they do what's called funeral cookies or biscuits. And these are actually wrapped in paper, it's sealed with sealing wax, and it was kind of just a treat or something they could take with them. Now the images in the frames there, that's actually showing some of the advertisements for it, because these could be commercially made or just locally made as well. The black seal on the funeral cookies, that is actually of a skull motif. The skulls and bones that you see in the Victorian era, a lot of times that represents memorte, morai, I believe is how you say it. But that is basically remember your death or remember your mortality. It's a belief in that time frame that actually predates the 1800s. It goes back 16th and 1700s. But you should lead a good life because you will die, basically. And in a lot of cases, it could be said you lead a good Christian life because you will die. Now, that is a replica sealing stamp ring that is based off one original one found at the original Jamestown colony. The table is from Newberry. The china cabinet is from Twin Oaks. Now, Twin Oaks gets its name from two large oak trees in the front yard. So this piece was actually made to represent it. So it was made during the time frame, and it is a one-of-a-kind piece. Buffet behind me is original to Uffington House and likely used by Margaret Hughes. And then on the table there, or buffet here, we do have a copy of character sketches by Charles Dickens with the illustrations behind it. And what that represents is, besides being Charles Dickens being a well-known British author, like Thomas Hughes, they were actually contemporaries in that sense, but they were family friends. And part of the reason we know this connection comes from an interview done in the Rugby newspaper with William Hastings Hughes. That's Thomas Hughes' younger brother. The editor of the newspaper was kind of fixated with this idea that Charles Dickens was crazy or insane. And he was asking Hastings about this. Well, Hastings mentioned that that Charles Dickens had visited their family home in England on numerous occasions, and he always acted as a well-respected English gentleman should. So that's how Hastings dismissed that. They'll show you, though, that the news has not changed a lot in the last several years. Now, the kitchen's a later addition to the house, so we're talking probably early 1900s to mid-1900s. At that time in the 1880s, we still believe that they tried to keep the kitchens detached from the main structure due to the fire issue, which was very common due to how these buildings are built. Your stove, though, is original to Newberry House, and it's a Kalamazoo Queen from Kalamazoo, Michigan, and it is a top-of-the-line stove, so it has some extra amenities, including a warming tray to keep your food warm, extra reservoir for hot water. You look at the oven, you can see it actually has a way to watch the temperature of the oven. And then this piece here is set up like your coils on your modern stovetop, but if you wanted to adjust the heat on for your fry pan or skillet, you could actually remove portions of it. And that would give you an open flame there. If you wanted to just take off the whole thing, you had a large enough skillet, you could remove the whole thing. And then that's, down here is actually where your wood for your wood burning stove will be for your cook stove. So
I would love to have one of those. Those are so awesome.
Now, in this shelf, there's a lot of different kitchen items, but the one that I want to mention specifically is the spice set there. That belonged to Margaret Hughes, and we actually believe she may have brought that over from England with her. So that's an original piece as well. They owned a donkey named Tom, and Tom figured out, before they had locks on the gates, how to get out of his pen and break into other pens and fences. So this is actually what they came up with. The gate has shifted a little bit, but this piece would actually slide up behind it. So that was to keep Tom the donkey where they wanted him.
Ah.
So the reason this church was formed in 1887 is because the Episcopalians started to realize that the three-story church and schoolhouse was not meeting their needs for space, for as far as the congregation, as well as the time they needed for service.
Oh, this is so pretty.
Welcome to the 1887 Christ Church, and y'all are welcome to have a seat in the pews if you like. So there are several original features to this church that are still present today. Your church pews, for one, are from 1887. A lot of your furniture up in the altar is also original to that time frame. Our stained glass window, which we're very fortunate to have back, it was actually gone temporarily for a restoration process. It was actually made in 1889. It was made in Germany and brought over from Germany at that time to be here in Rugby, Tennessee. And to my surprise, it actually survived the journey without any damage. So that's pretty impressive. But a lot of your symbols are Christian-based. So the lilies represent the resurrection of Christ. The grapes, the blood of Christ. The wheat, body of Christ. Two symbols down at the bottom. That's Alpha and Omega from the Greek alphabet, and it represents the beginning and the end, who was really a heart of the colony in a sense. And then the other woman is Mary Blacklock, and that's the mother of Joseph Blacklock, the first church rector. Now, the Blacklock family did purchase an item that we still have today. It's back in the corner under the model of the church. It is the original reed organ. As far as I understand, it doesn't function, but that was purchased by the Blacklock family in London and brought over here for church service. So that's another original feature. Now, back in the corner, there is a statue that was made in later time, but that's to remember those who perished during a typhoid fever epidemic. So the very first year of the colony was kind of difficult for the colonists. The winter of 1880 to 1881 was one of the worst winters on record for the Cumberland Plateau. Colonists made the best of it. They did go ice skating, but to give you an idea how cold it was, parts of the Clear Fork River froze from bank to bank. Fast forward to summer of 1881, you have one of the worst droughts on record. And then they say bad news travels in three. Well, in August of 1881, the colonists suffered a typhoid fever outbreak. Now that is caused by contaminated drinking water, it's sewage and other filth in the water. Dr. Kemp was a physician here at the time. He did call in two physicians from Cincinnati to help contain it, but they ended up having roughly 23 colonists that had symptoms, according to the newspaper. Now those symptoms varied, but in the case of Emily Hughes, Thomas's niece, Hastings' daughter, she had a symptoms of 102 fever. Case study said they documented her as being very pale-faced, but also symptom of anorexia and insomnia. And in her case, I think it went on for about 2 to 3 weeks. Now, she survived, fortunately. However, they had 7 colonists that did not survive. Those 7 colonists passed away in the month of August and September. There is an 8th colonist mentioned on burial records, but that person did not pass away until March of 1882. But the idea was it was caused by complications that arose from that typhoid fever outbreak. Now, Dr. Kemp was a physician. He wanted to track an outbreak, and they tracked it to the public drinking well at the Tavern Inn. Now, it was basically caused by the lateral lines and drainage from the outhouse and other things filtering into the water. That's the official cause. That being said, I'm going to throw this out there, and you can make up your own mind of how you feel about it. By August 1st, all those people had symptoms of typhoid fever. Prior to August 1st, there is a newspaper article dated July 9th, 1881, and it is about Mr. Brown, who owned the Brown House. Apparently, Mr. Brown was trying to store some raw meat, and he was trying to preserve it for the meal in the next coming days. Well, he was caught storing it in the public drinking well. Now, the article itself says that they were really concerned this could contaminate the water. I cannot say for sure that Mr. Brown was responsible, but the timing is also very coincidental. July 9th, 1881, August 1st, 1881. So that's what that statue there is, to remember those who did perish from typhoid. And officially, as far as newspapers and such, the colony was doomed to end before it even began. So that's just...
Oh, I love these doors. Oh my gosh. Oh, check her out. Oh, she's spooky.
So they're all 1900s. Yes. So welcome to the Hughes Public Library, and it did open October 5th, 1882. Now, even though it opened at that time, the librarian Edward Burt's, who's the man in the picture over here on the shelf hanging, he was actually not wanting this library to open and the books to be checked out until he had a chance to truly inventory and catalog them. So there was a short time after 1882. You could only come in here and look at the books in the library. You could not take them with you. But once it became operational, this was considered the first lending library in the southern U.S. at the time frame. So what you have here is close to 7,000 books, all printed before the 1900s. And then you also have magazines and periodicals from that time frame as well. So the first 5,000 books were donated by different publishing companies. The other 2,000 books came from the colonists who lived here, as well as just people passing through. We have Miss Mary dressed up, and technically she would be dressed up in what would be the half mourning period. Your full mourning period is usually 6 months to a year, and they would have to wear solid black clothing, and it'd usually be black crepe, which is like silk and wool mixed. They could not wear lace in the half or in the full mourning period. The lace veil would come in the half mourning. Now, half mourning does allow a few other options. They can add a few different colors. White could be added. Some of the different hues of purple could also be added. You could actually start wearing mourning jewelry, which is what we have a variety of items here. Oh. And all the mourning jewelry has different symbolic meaning. I don't know all of it, but some things like daisies is symbolic to youth. Roses is love. I think pansies is mortality. Now, in the brooches here, there's one that has a quiver with arrows, and that's representative of family. Of course, you do see the feminine hand as a motif for the brooches, and the interlocking hands, that's actually a symbol for friendship. And it's a variety of materials that they use to make these. Now, all these are replica, but like the white would be using ivory, the dull black would be pressed horn. They had a variety of man-made materials, some of which are actually flammable. But these are all the different sentimental type jewelry that you wear as a woman. Now, men's mourning period's a little bit different. They usually only have a period of 3 months. They're going to wear the same clothes they'd wear for anything. If they did add anything to represent mourning, it might be like a black armband or a sash on the arm. Now, if you were of a wealthy class family, and you could afford it, and you lived in the cities, for example, you could get your dresses and clothing from mourning warehouses. That's what these were basically commercial outfits designed to give you all the clothing and make the dresses for you. If you cannot afford something like that, typically the lower class families would take the dresses they already own and dye them black. That's where you do get some variation in colors on that. And then you add other mourning attire, everything from a black mourning fan. Of course, in half mourning you can add beads, and you have the black beaded purse. Again, the kind of the lace look for the gloves. Now the ring here is actually a mourning ring. It's a replica, but it's a replica of one that was used by Queen Victoria. The flower in the center of it represents the forget-me-not flower, which is a symbol for remembrance. Now, as I said, she stayed in pretty much mourning the rest of her life, and you can see that through some of the images later in life there. Of course, there is a proclamation of her death. But this is a statue unveiling, and this is the front cover from one of our original newspapers, but it's dated 1889, the London Illustrated News. And this was a statue unveiling for a duke had passed, but look at the clothing she's wearing in it. Even there, she's wearing more your mourning attire. So even though this colony did decline by the 1900 period, and it was not really just a true British colony, it did actually, they did actually acknowledge the death of Queen Victoria when she passed. There was a young man named George Walton. He was asked by his headmaster to hang a British flag from the banister of the school, which would have been the three-story church and schoolhouse at that time, which is why we did the same thing. So he hung a flag for her, and they did try to have a funeral service, although not very much information about the service is there available due to the fact it sounds like there was an inclement weather day. The rain and wind not only ruined the service, it actually damaged the flag. So when Queen Elizabeth II passed away, we tried to use some of the information we knew about how they honored Queen Victoria to honor Queen Elizabeth II. That's why our schoolhouse has the British flag and the black flag underneath it. So that was one thing.
Oh, wow. That's a little casket.
Alright. So here in the 1907 schoolhouse, I'll get into the building here in a minute, but kind of concluding the Rugby edge in black, which actually relates to the 5th, I didn't think about that. We are honoring the death of Margaret Hughes. Now, as far as our record, it does not show that she had a funeral in her house, Uffington, which is the building in the illustration back in the back. That is her residence that she lived at. Her service actually took place in the original three-story church and schoolhouse, which is this image here. And apparently that was the last funeral service for this building. So she passed away on October 5th, and by October 7th, they did have a service at the church, followed by a short service at Laureldale Cemetery. She was led from the church in a carriage, led by her horse, her white horse, who was led by her gardener, who took her down to this Laureldale Cemetery, which would be her final resting place. So this is actually the headstone that was purchased by William Hastings and Thomas Hughes, and it is of an open book design, is what they designed it for. So that's her headstone, which you can still go to today and pay your respects. The bookmarks on her casket is actually the obituary from the Cincinnati newspaper. It is printed by our print shop, but what they had to announce was the death of Tom Brown's mother, is how they referred to her. And they mentioned that they had received news from Rugby, Tennessee, that she passed October 5th, and then of course buried on October 7th. So that was kind of the news that Cincinnati newspaper had received about her. Now the fern reef, the reason we use ferns in the reef here as well as the one that we have on top is because her and Emily, it looks like, did have a fernery because the native ferns in this area are so spectacular, they were amazed by them. So a lot of times when people passed away before Margaret's death, you do see her name sending a decor or something for the funeral service. A lot of times it mentions fern wreaths or other fern arrangements. So we did one for her to honor Margaret Hughes. Now, the image down at the back, that's the Hughes family crest, and that image is a copy found originally from in a book that belonged to Margaret Hughes, is where we found their family crest from. So again, that's why we're honoring her in this location, because this building replaced the three-story church and schoolhouse in 1907. This one burned in 1906. Sadly, a fire had spread from a residence behind it and took both buildings. And they built this one on the same location in 1907. So this building was used as a one-room schoolhouse from 1907 roughly until 1951. Now, for the first few years after 1907, the second floor was used by the Masons. When that order disbanded, ironically due to some issues with drunkenness, apparently, Morgan County School District had ownership of the entire building. Now, instead of changing things upstairs, they used that as more of an open floor plan, and that became the lunchroom or cafeteria for the school. This part here would have been cleared out. This would have been your classroom. And it was literally a rugby school for all ages. Now, it did operate as a school until 1951. After 1951, the building went vacant for a little less than a year. Then it was used as a pleasant the temporary quarters for the Pleasant Hill Baptist Church for about 2 years at the most. And then it looks like it was vacant until 1980. Now in 1980, Historic Rugby Incorporated had already been formed. They purchased the building with the intent of renovating it and making it our main visitor center for Historic Rugby. It did not open until 1985. Now when it opened in 1985, the second floor was closed to the public, which it still is today. That became the offices for Historic Rugby. The first floor, they added a visitor service desk with a staff member or volunteer, and then it started becoming basically a museum with different history throughout the time frame of rugby. And that's still kind of how we use it today, although it's not being used as a true visitor center because our new building was built about 2006. So that is actually our visitor center, and this becomes part of the tour. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of guide you through briefly and give you an idea of everything there is in this building. Now, since this was our visitor center, one exception to the tour is here in a moment. After I go through this building with you, I will give you some time to explore it on your own. The only thing I ask is when you leave, you go out the front door we came in and push it shut so it locks. So starting off with what all displays you have here, this little corner focuses on the education for here in Rugby. So there is information about the 3-story church and schoolhouse, the 2-story schoolhouse that we're standing in today, as well as a tidbit information about the Arnold School. Now that was a college preparatory school for boys, only lasted about a year, but it was designed in 1885. And what's significant about it is the structure for that school was based off of the structure and the ideas that Thomas Hughes actually gained by going to the Rugby School in England, which is the one he wrote his book Tom Brown's School Days about. Now the name Arnold refers to Thomas Arnold, who was the headmaster when Thomas Hughes attended the Rugby School. There are a few interactives there with the chalkboard and the slate board because ironically those things are becoming a thing of the past, and a lot of children nowadays, as well as adults, are not familiar with actually using those items. So that's why we have those as added as well. Now this is getting into the dream developing, and that's going to be this next display, which we'll talk about in a second. But what dream are they talking about? Well, it was a dream that Thomas Hughes had for this colony to be a utopian-based colony. And that is a colony based up of people of different nationalities, different social economic backgrounds, different races, and even different religions, as long as Christian denomination, all working together in a cooperative mindset. So that was actually a utopian dream he had for this colony, and that's what they're talking about as development. So we'll walk down here. And as the dream develops, this goes into a lot of different aspects of the colony. Just the formation of the colony. Of course, you got a picture of the railroad when he would have came through. That railroad station, or the railroad track itself, is 7 miles from here in the unincorporated town of Elgin, is where the modern rail line is. Those days it was referred to as Sedgemore. So from there you have a 7-mile dirt road to get from Sedgemore to Rugby. So just a lot of other aspects with some of the people here, of course the Board of Aid office, just different things forming this colony. Now the green wall focuses on the person Thomas Hughes himself. We have some of the books he wrote encased in glass. We have his views on Rugby Colony. Now a lot of these views come from the modern copy is the Rugby Tennessee book there that he actually wrote originally. And then of course we have his most popular book, Tom Brown's School Days, that he also wrote. But in the Rugby Tennessee book, that was kind of designed to encourage the young men from England to come and form this colony. So it had some of the things they were going to have, as well as expectations that he had for the colony that may have not actually been met. And then you have how he is viewed in the public eye. He was a respected Englishman, and in a lot of cases he was very well respected. However, he was also a little bit ahead of his time. He was involved in social reform and humanitarian efforts, and a lot of other aspects. So the reason I point out both sides of that, there shows you a little bit about what people thought. But if you look at the Vanity Fair image from 1872, the image itself is not what I call a respectable image of Thomas Hughes. So that's why I show you both sides. Now from that display, we go into this little corner display. And this focuses on our commissary. Now today's reproduction commissary is a gift shop. It is on the location of the original, which was a 2-story building like today's. The first floor was basically your general merchandise store for the colony. It was originally ran on the cooperative principle. Colonists were required to take $5 shares in stock. And they did have shareholder meetings. But after 1884, it became more privately run. But it basically served as all your supply center for Rugby. So you can think of it today as a Walmart. So the first floor, though, was where your product sales and all purchases would take place. The second floor was Commissary Hall. And that basically served as a shareholder meeting where they'd have their shareholder meetings. But then it became as an event center. So they had a rugby cornet band, a dramatic and music society. They had all these different social organizations and social things that Thomas Hughes wanted, but the community had. So some of those organizations would do like holiday events in the Commissary Hall. Or like in this picture here, you can see some of the ladies rehearsing for a play or a skit. So some of those events were just for fun. Some of them were actually benefit things that could raise money for like the 3-story schoolhouse, the library, and other organizations. Now the barber's chair here, the barber's chair is an original 1880s barber's chair. It is from Rugby. And for the last 20 to 30 years, everybody believes it's from the commissary. And it could be, I just don't know yet. What I've found for primary sources, though, through the newspaper, is they did have a barber shop, not at the commissary, but they had one at the Tabard Hotel, which we've got an advertisement for. And then we also had one where a gentleman had opened it in his residence. So there could have been one at the commissary, I just can't prove it yet. However, I used what I had to give you an idea of what a barber shop at that time frame would look like, using some replica items from my display. The humor and wit section, that's just basically jokes and such in the newspapers at the time about barbers. So like that first one is barbers make many friends, but it's great more acquaintances. So there is a small section over there on the back, on that side over there. This deals with Rugby's first family, and that's going to be the ones who lived here. Margaret Hughes, Emily Hughes, and Hastings Hughes. And you do have pictures of Uffington House when they lived there, as well as the interior, and you can see Margaret Hughes in those pictures on the side. The coat rack and this entire back wall, as well as this display case, deals with our 2 Tabard hotels, or Tabard Inns. The first one is that building over there in the corner. That's the 1880 to 1884 Tabard Inn. Now, when it burned, it was a huge loss for the revenue for the colony. However, the owner did not have insurance, so they had to struggle to get it rebuilt. What they came up with, though, is this building here in 1887. Sadly, though, by 1900, that building too would burn. So you see some of the original furnishings from the Tabard Inn, as well as information on how the Tabard Inn got its name. It was based off the name of the London's Tabard Inn in England that burned in 1873. Now, there is a baluster that remains. You can see it in that picture, and then if you look in this case, that's the one that remained from that. Now, that one comes from Geoffrey Chaucer's book, Canterbury Tales. That's where the namesake comes from. But it tells you even more about the Tabard and where that name comes. Now, the chairs and the TV is just a place where we show our orientation video if our theater is in use for events. But this gets into why the dream started to fade and the colony declined. So they did continue having management problems between the local Board of Aid versus the London Board of Aid. Of course, that horrible first year with the weather and climate, that did work against them. And then the terrible typhoid fever. They were promised a 7-mile spur line from the main rail line to Rugby. That promise was never kept. The land itself, Cumberland Plateau, is not really the most hospitable as far as soil content for agricultural, which is one of their main goals, so that did work against them. But really, what was the straw that broke the camel's back was when Margaret Hughes passed away. She was so much a major part of the community, and when she passed away, Thomas Hughes was already heading back to England. He donated his house, Kingston Lisle, to Christ Church to be used as a rectory. That's all you hear from Thomas Hughes at that point. His brother Hastings had remarried to a woman from Massachusetts, so he moved to Massachusetts. And Emily, Hastings' daughter, also joined him in Massachusetts shortly later. So that's where your Hughes family left the colony. And it did decline. Now, I will not say it died, and I'll explain that in a few minutes. This display here focuses on weaving and sewing, and it goes through the whole process, but a lot of it is focusing on the woman over here in these pictures. This is Dicea Fletcher, or Aunt Dicey. She came about in the early 1900 period, but she was well known for doing traditional sewing and weaving, specifically coverlet making. Now, she could do Appalachian designs as well as the British designs, and she was very popular and well known. In fact, she had her artwork, is really what it was, on display in 24 states in the U.S., as well as several European colonies or countries as well. We do have 4 original to Aunt Dicey in the case right there on the wall. The other one down at the bottom is not Aunt Dicey's, but it does show you the diversity of how these coverlets are made in the different designs. Now, Aunt Dicey is a contrast from this woman. This is Mrs. Mazingill, who lived in the Mazingill home place back behind the Visitor Center. She was part of the original Appalachian families that lived here before the colony and during the colony. They did, Miss Mazingill, for example, did interact with Emily Hughes and some of the other women from England. But in her case, her weaving and sewing was a necessity. It wasn't a hobby or an art form. It was just something she had to do as part of her life. Now, she's the one that Emily Hughes mentioned showing Emily how to card wool and spinning some, show her. And then they sat and talked for a while, and she smoked a pipe after dinner, which I'm not sure how Emily Hughes thought of that. But it does show you that both cultures, even distinctly different, they did interact and get along for the most part very well. So you do get those different variations in nationality and even beliefs and stuff in different cultures. Now our last little displays here covers a variety of things, but this brings into how Historic Rugby Incorporated was formed. It was started by this gentleman here, 16-year-old Brian Stagg, and he was lived in the neighboring community of Deer Lodge, which is not very far from us. But he fell in love with the story of English gentry coming to Rugby. And he wanted it to be preserved. Now he went looking for help, kind of got redirected until to form his own organization, which he did, and that was the Rugby Restoration Association, which he ran as executive director until his passing in 1976. After he passed away, his sister Barbara Stagg served as our executive director, and she retired the early 2000 period. She's still alive today, but she lives in Colorado now. So what that literally became was Historic Rugby Incorporated, which is a 501(c) nonprofit organization that currently has a staffing of 5. So it's a mixture of part-time and full-time staff. And our operational funding comes from tour fees, lodging fees, memberships, and donations. So I thank you for doing the tour because that's actually helping us. Now it gets a little confusing though, because if you just stepped outside and look through this courtyard, or even in the visitor center, you'll see other signs that have nothing to do with Historic Rugby Incorporated as far as titles and such. One is the Big South Fork National Recreation Area. That is a national park site that covers in Tennessee and into Kentucky. Our property actually borders some of theirs, so they interpret the Big South Fork and some of the tributaries and the history and the nature that ties back into it. So in our case, they interpret the Clear Fork River, which was used by the early colonists from Rugby. That's where you had your gentleman's swimming hole initially. Of course, there is 2 hiking trails, the gentleman's swimming hole and the meeting of waters. But if you can see in this picture, in 1885, the colonists actually had a fun picnic and some other activities down on the Clear Fork. So they're focusing more on just the Clear Fork and the Big South Fork. So how that works to us is we do partner with them. They are not involved in any operational funding. Occasionally we do get funding from grants and stuff, but that's a whole grant process. So it's a partnership. They do station a ranger here on Saturdays and Sundays during the summer months, and that's where the desk in the visitor center comes in for them. But it is a partnership. It's 2 different agencies working together. Now, to make it a little bit more complicated, is you've got the Mazingill home place, which is a hiking trail back behind the visitor center. Now, their home does not exist anymore. There is some interpretive signage and things talking about on the trail that you can learn about the Mazingills. But as far as their actual cabin, it's been lost to time. The property itself, though, is listed as Tennessee State Natural Area. So it is owned by the state of Tennessee, and if there are any legal issues or any of that, the state of Tennessee will deal with that. But they do not provide staffing like they would in the state park. And over 90% of the maintenance of that property is contracted to Historic Rugby staff and volunteers. So again, it's another partnership between the 2 different agencies. So there are advantages and disadvantages about it, but what's one unique thing about that, plus you consider all of our visitors, our community, our staff, volunteers, everything, and even what you see in these pictures, there has been a sense of community. Even though the community of Rugby declined by 1900, it continued on through the ages. So why is that so significant? Well, for 2 reasons. One, it shows that Thomas Hughes' utopian dream of a community, a utopian community, is still alive and well today. We are a community of people of different nationalities, different races, different religions, and different social economic backgrounds, all working together to support Historic Rugby and the history of this area. Now, it does not mean everybody gets along. That's the problem with utopian communities. It does ask everybody to get along and work as a common good. That's never going to happen. However, for the most part, though, everybody does work toward the common good of historic rugby. We may not agree, but we do work toward that. So that is very unique, for one, because utopian communities are considered a myth because of what I just told you. Also, if you look throughout history and throughout the world, you can find utopian communities all over. What's rare, though, is when you start looking into them, you go to the sites and start looking for tangible evidence that they existed, you won't find any of that, although so many of them have been lost to time. Then you look at the few that have tangible evidence, like historic rugby. It's even a lesser number that actually have a modern community that has that utopian mindset connected to it. So that's one of the unique things about historic rugby in corporate, or historic rugby in general, is because we are actually a representation of that. We're not the only one, but there's not very many of us. So that's something I hope you leave with. And also realize that being visitors and taking part here, you are very much a part of that community as well. So keep that in mind for if you're passing through again, or if you live close by. We have events that you can come to help our funding, but it also helps people take part in that community. The tea setting there is a replica of that. We do holiday teas where people can buy a ticket and take part in a formal tea. Of course, we have our Spring Fest, the British Spring Fest in springtime. Ghostly Gathering, which our tickets have sold out for the 2 Saturdays in October, but that does include some of the more interesting history and some of the Rugby Edge and Black stuff. We have Christmas and Rugby, another event. So we have events year-round. Now we do close for the season, for the winter season, which is roughly 3rd week in December to about mid-March. But there's all sorts of opportunities where you can take part and take more involved in this utopian community that is historic rugby today. So if you guys have any questions or anything, you can find me at the Visitor Center. Like I said, you can explore this building some more if you'd like. Just when you leave, go out that front door and push it shut and it'll lock automatically. Now the letter on the door, that is actually the wording of Brian Stagg, our former executive director. And it's really what he's hoped people would gain from coming to rugby and what experiences he had. So you're welcome to read that as well. But I hope you guys have a good day.
Thank you. Hey guys, this is the conclusion to this video. That was just a little bit of a historical tour of this little bitty town of Rugby, Tennessee. It is so cute. There's only like 70 people here, but they do offer paranormal tours, overnight stays. There's a couple houses here that offers like a bed and breakfast. You can rent a room, and you can also do a paranormal investigation overnight. And if you're interested in doing that, just contact somebody at the Visitor Center, and they'll give you all that information. So I hope you enjoyed it. I know to some people it's kind of boring, but when you're history buffs like me and my husband, all this old stuff is just so fascinating to us. So if you haven't done it yet, please like, subscribe, and share this video. And thank you for watching. We very much appreciate it, and we'll see you in the next video.